Hello, welcome to yet another edition of our class in Literature in English. Now, in the previous segment, we had treated two recommended poems, one from the African category and the other from the non-African category. Of course, we had wholly examined William Blake's The Schoolboy and also Kofi Awono's The Anvil and the Hammer. In today's segment, we are going to be looking at two African poems. The first is Gbanabom Hallowell's The Dining Table, and we are also going to be looking at Piano and Drums as put forward by Gabriel Okara. Now, let's begin with The Dining Table. A very quick background into this poem reveals that the poet had documented this poem against the background of the Sierra Leonean Civil War that lasted from 1991 to 2002, an 11-year civil war. Now, of which we will understand, issues that are always occasioned by war are usually unpleasant. We may be talking about hunger, we may be talking about malnutrition, death, destructions of lives and properties, and all forms of negativities that are associated with war. Now, it is also very necessary to point out that war times usually do not favor any class of people, as the effects usually cut across males and females, children, and perhaps some poor and some elite people in the society. So it is against this background that Gbanabom Hallowell had put up this poem titled The Dining Table. Now, let's begin to analyze the title of this poem. When we talk about the dining table, one thing comes to our mind, and that is a feast that has to do with eating and drinking. But perhaps, as literally expected, the content of this poem will somewhat be ironical to the usual dining, which is literally expected. Now, it moves away from the literal aspect of eating and drinking to the literary aspect of perhaps bloodbath and all forms of violence, of which we are going to eventually analyze. Now, let's read The Dining Table. Dinner tonight comes with gun wounds. Our desert tongues lick the vegetable blood. The pepper strong enough to push scorpions up our heads. Guests look into the oceans of bowels as vegetables die on their tongues. The table that gathers us is an island where gorillas walk the land while crocodiles surf. Children from Alpha Beta with empty palms dine with us, switchblades in their eyes, silence in their voices. When the playground is emptied of children's toys, who needs roadblocks? When the hour to drink from the cup of life ticks, cholera breaks its spell on cracked lips. Under the spilled milk of the moon, I promise to be a revolutionary, but my Nile, even without tributaries, comes lazy upon its own Nile. On these nights reserved for lovers of fire, I'm full with the catch of gun wounds, and my boots have suddenly become too reluctant to walk me. That is The Dining Table by Gbanabom Hallowell. Now, as we will eventually try to analyze every content of this poem, you will clearly see that the poet clearly paints a picture of suffering, the issues of war, the problems that are associated with the expectations of a war period, which of course we had said is usually very unpleasant. Now, in the first instance of the poem, the first stanza specifically, like we had said, the reader may sometimes expect that the dining table as a poem may usually or specifically feature the dining table as we will eventually think it is in the ordinary parlance. But the first line of the poem reads, dinner tonight comes with gun wounds. Immediately, the first line of that poem has really reversed our minds, of which we had thought would be the normal dinner that is characterized with drinking and eating. It says dinner tonight comes with gun wounds. Our desert tongues lick the vegetable blood. Perhaps you will always say that the soldiers had finished fighting for the day, and then they are accounting for what had happened, the issues they have encountered for the day in a table in order to give an account of their experiences for that day. And in this type of dinner, we do not see food or drinks. Rather, we see blood, we see wounds, we see desert tongues. The poet says that the normal dinner which we usually eat is not the one he is referring to. That is an ironical expression. He says that the dinner for tonight comes with gun wounds, of which desert tongues will lick vegetable blood. Now, desert tongues there is a metaphorical expression that talks about extreme thirst. Deserts have to do with dryness, of which we have said is one of the characteristic features as occasioned by war. Then we say that the vegetable blood, of which is strong enough to push scorpions off our heads, guests look into the oceans of bowels as vegetable dye on their tongues. Now, in the second stanza, the poet speaker says, the table that gathers us is an island. Please take note. He says that this table is not the original dining table of which we will eventually thought it would be. Now, he says the table that gathers us is an island where gorillas walk the land while crocodiles surf. That is strongly the usage of personification. When we talk about the surf, of course, we are referring to that item of which sports people, especially those who are always sporting on rivers, use to maintain balance while they do the sporting surf event. Now, in this case, we can see the use of personification where crocodiles are being personified to surf, of which it's usually the activities of humans. Now, in the third line, the poet speaker maintains that children from Alpha Beta with empty palms dine with us. Now, when you say children from Alpha Beta, this is the introduction of child soldiers. Now, the poet speaker is maintaining by including this line that the war does not exclude children. Children from Alpha Beta there, of course, metaphorically explains that these are very young children who are learning the English alphabets. Perhaps they are supposed to be in school at the time, but because of the war situation, they have been left away from school to fight a war they did not cause. That is why he maintained that children from Alpha Beta does what? Dine with us. The empty palm there, of course, is metaphorically explaining the innocence of the children who do not in any way contribute to the cause of this war, but are largely suffering its effects. Now, if you move to the next stanza, he says that when the playground is emptied of children's toys, who needs roadblocks? That is a rhetorical question. He is raising this question as an awareness or for consciousness of which children who are supposed to either be in their classrooms to learn or perhaps play with their toys have left those ideal activities in order to fight for things they could not in any way contribute to. Now, in the following line, the poet speaker says that when the hour to drink from the cup of life ticks, cholera breaks its spell on cracked lips. Now, this is also a situation that is occasioned by war. Cholera primarily is a disease that is caused by drinking or eating contaminated water or food. And this is always one of the most striking diseases that people suffer during the time of war. Of course, clean water is usually very scarce and is always inaccessible. Food is always the same, as scarce as it should be. And then we see children or people generally eating unclean food and drink just to maintain their subsistence on earth. And immediately this happens, the outcome or the tantamount effect will always be cholera. That's what he said, that when the hour to drink from the cup of life ticks, of which people are dying as a result of this disease, cholera does what? Breaks its spell on cracked lips. Cracked lips there explains poverty, suffering as occasioned by war. Now, in the last stanza, the poet speaker is making a very serious clarion call when he says, "Under the spilt milk of the moon, I promise to be a revolutionary, but my Nile, even without tributaries, comes lazy upon its Nile." Now, the poet speaker, having explained the sufferings, the circumstances, the problems, the situations that have been characterized by war, he makes a very strong resolution that he has made a plan to do what? To revolt against the situation. He believes that these wars are usually caused by the few elites of a society, yet the masses suffer even more than the causes of these very grievous incidents. As a result, he concludes that he is planning to revolt. He wants to be a revolutionary, even though the system does not favor such arrangement. Now, in the last line, he says, "On this night reserved for lovers of fire, I'm full with the catch of gun wounds, and my boots have suddenly become too reluctant to walk me." Now, in that stanza, there is a serious presentation of contrast. In the first part of the last stanza, the poet speaker is making a very serious determination to revolt against the system. But in the concluding part of that stanza, he explains and admits his weaknesses, that even though he knows that the best way to change the circumstances is to revolt against the system, the boots he is wearing, of course, that metaphorically explains the weapons, the system, the parameters, the issues that are required to revolt may not actually be available. Now you see that the poet speaker is ending this poem in a very hopeless way. He seems to describe the situation, he seems to explain the problems, but he also suggested the most suitable way out, even when he is unable to confirm that he will be able to use this strategy in solving the problem. So that is the dining table by Gbanabom Hallowell. We had explained clearly every stanza of this poem. We have been able to explain the contents as possible. As we progress in this lesson, we are going to be exposing you to the literary contents as used in this poem. Now let's switch now to the themes in the poem. Now the first theme in this poem is war and destruction. War and destruction. When we talk about war, we are explaining the extreme form of conflict and violence. It is usually a situation where there is absolute breakdown of law and order, so that people pick arms in order to defend their situation or their position in a conflicting matter. And then this is actually the case in this poem. Anytime there is a war, then it is likely, in fact, it is almost impossible that destruction will be inevitable. So war and destruction are twin concepts when it comes to issues like this. Now, the poet speaker explains the situation of war where everything is destroyed. We can also see instances where children, which he called alpha beta, are supposed to be in school, but they are part of the war. We have also seen the issue of suffering. We've seen the issue of thirst, the cholera issue. All these are metaphorical expressions that have to do with destruction as occasioned by war. Now, the second theme is the theme of violence and bloodbath. The theme of violence and bloodbath. If you quickly move with me to the first stanza of the poem, you will see clearly that the poet speaker explains that dinner tonight comes with gun wounds. Gun wounds. And then he went further to explain that our desert tongues lick the vegetable blood and the pepper strong enough to push scorpions up our heads. This is strongly a very serious instance of violence and bloodbath. It is a situation where people's lives do not really matter anymore. It is a situation where people are exchanging gun wounds and bullet shots as a way of maintaining a position in the matter. Now, even in the last stanza of the poem, you see clearly that the poet speaker himself is speaking from a situation of suffering and bloodbath. He says that I'm full with the catch of gun wounds. That means the poet speaker is not only analyzing or putting up the story in this poem from a distant perspective. he is telling us perhaps the experiences of which he is part and parcel of. So we can see instances of violence and bloodbath. Now, in the third theme is the theme of child soldiers. Now, who is a child soldier? A child soldier is a young person who has been conscripted, coerced, or forced to fight in a war of which is not part of his consent. Now, when a child soldier is involved, it simply means that that person is underage to fight a war. But because of the unavailability of manpower during these circumstances, children are always inadequately trained to be involved in the fighting of a war. They are given guns to shoot and also defend their territories. And this poem actually captures this. If we quickly follow the poem to the second stanza, it clearly explains the theme of child soldiers, and it reads, "The table that gathers us is an island where growlers walk and learn while crocodiles surf." Now, in the second part of that stanza, the poet speaker says that children from Alpha Beta with empty palms dine with us. That simply means that those who are involved in the war activity also involve children. Children are part and parcel of the whole thing. That explains the issue of child soldier. And for sake of emphasis, I will refer you to a very chronicle novel that captures this theme, and that is a novel written by Maiwela and is titled Beasts of No Nations. In your spare time, if you find this novel and read, it will really expose you to the issue in this poem called The Dining Table. So children are involved in the fighting of the war. They fight the war in which I would say they were not part and parcel. Now, if you move to the last theme, suffering occasioned by war. Now, this theme is painted all over the poem. Right from the first part of the poem till the last, we see instances of suffering occasioned by war. Now, let us specifically point out these aspects. Now, in the first line, the poet speaker says that dinner tonight comes with gun wounds. You will agree with me, or if you could picture a human being moving around with gun wounds, that will be a clear picture of a person who is suffering. And then in the second stanza, we see the issue of hunger and thirst. These soldiers do not have a lot to eat. They do not have a lot to drink, yet they are mandated as a matter of necessity or urgency to fight in a war. The second line of that first stanza says, "Our desert tongues lick the vegetable blood." Now, that is a very serious element of suffering. Perhaps they are thirsty to drink, desert tongues, and what they should get is water. But we see that the poet speaker maintains that what they get is vegetable blood, and of which the pepper is strong enough to push scorpions up the heads. That is seriously a suffering situation. Now, if you move again into the second stanza, you will see clearly that even children who are supposed to be in school are fighting in the war. They are not enjoying the experience, as the speaker says that he sees sweet blades in their eyes and silence in their voice. Switchblades in their eyes and silence in their voice. That means they are not happy with what they are doing, but they have been coerced or forced to do this. Now, there have been also many aspects of suffering occasioned by war, and we see the poet speaker also admitted that he is tired. He knows he must be a revolutionary. He must revolt against the system. He must turn against the situation, but of which he had admitted clearly that the parameters are not available for him. So those are the four themes that are very inherent in the poem: war and destruction, the theme of violence and bloodbath, the theme of child soldiers, and then lastly but not the least, the theme of suffering occasioned by war. Now, having analyzed the themes in the poem, let's try to look at the figurative expressions or devices as used in the poem. Now, let's begin with the title of the poem, The Dining Table. Now, like I had explained previously, the dining table connotes eating and drinking. But what we eventually saw in the poem is an exact opposite of the title of the poem. So the title of the poem and the content are ironical to each other. So the title suggests something different from its real meaning. So that is an ironical expression. Now do not forget that we said an irony is a situation in which a speaker or a writer puts up an incident that is exactly opposite to the intended meaning. So the dining table there is an ironical expression. Now if you quickly run through the poem, you will see that the first line in the first stanza, dinner tonight comes with gun wounds. That is an employment of personification. Now do not also forget that personification is that figure of speech in which human attributes are being transferred to non-human beings, so that human beings will now be sitting back to watch non-humans perform their actions. Now if you say dinner tonight comes, now the action there is comes, but dinner tonight, which is a non-human or inanimate, has been personified to look like a human that is performing the action of coming. Now our desert tongues there is a metaphorical expression that has to do with the state of being extremely very thirsty. Desert tongues, it talks about the state of being very thirsty. Now if you move to the second stanza, the table that gathers us is an island where gorillas walk. That's also the usage of personification, where gorillas, which are non-humans or inanimate, are being personified to perform the action of walking, to walk. Now if you move down to the last sentence of that stanza, it says children from Alpha Beta with empty palms. Children from Alpha Beta with empty palms. That children from Alpha Beta strongly signifies children who are supposed to be in schools learning the English alphabet. Then the empty palms there simply is a metaphorical expression that has to do with innocence, clearly, of which when we talk about empty palms, that's what we clearly refer to. Now in this statement in the third stanza, it said, when the playground is emptied of children's toys, who needs root blocks? That is a strong usage of a rhetorical question. We have said that rhetorical questions are those questions of which a speaker raises them to express emotions or to place emphasis, of which an answer is not expected. Now, if we moved on to, he said, when they are to drink from the cup of life ticks. That's a euphemism. When they are to drink from the cup of life ticks. That's a euphemistic statement that talks about the nearness of death. This means the person is about to die. When they are to drink from the cup of life ticks. That's a strong euphemism. That statement explains that the person is about to die. Then we could also see personification contained in that statement when he talked about the cup of life ticking. That's another expression of personification. Now, if we move to the last stanza, we said, under the split moon of the moon, I promised to be a revolutionary, but my Nile, even without tributaries, comes lazy upon its own Nile. On this night reserved for lovers of fire, I'm full with the catch of gun wounds, and my boots have suddenly become too reluctant to walk me. My boots have suddenly become too reluctant. You can see that the boots have been personified again. The boots have been presented to appear or perform like human beings. The boots have been described to be reluctant. The boots have been described to be too tired to walk, and that becomes personification. Now let's look at this question and see how we can test our knowledge. The dominant figure of speech in Hallowell's The Dining Table is A. Personification, B. Metonymy, C. Simile, and D. Rhetorical question. Now we may not likely trace any instance of metonymy, neither have we seen simile, but we can see personification and rhetorical questions in that poem. But the question says, which of these figurative expressions is dominant? What we mean by that is which of them is more expressive. And like we have seen several instances of personification more than rhetorical question, of which rhetorical question came in only once, but we have seen up to 5 or 6 illustrations of personification, and that makes it the answer. The correct answer to that question is in option A, and that is personification. Now, let's move to the next poem in still the African category, and that is Piano and Drums by Gabriel Okara. Piano and Drums. Now, this is a familiar thing. When we talk about piano and drums are musical instruments. But one thing I want you to understand about these two musical instruments is that one of them is a foreign musical instrument, which is the piano. And then the other, drums, is an African musical instrument. I know we must have been using the piano in almost every gathering as far as entertainment is concerned, or music. But one thing that you should understand is that piano is a Western importation. It is not an African development. But from time immemorial, pre-colonial African situations, Africans have always been expressing their songs and music by the drums and other African musical instruments. So when we hear this title, piano and drums, simply from this interpretation, it should give us an insight into what Gabriel Okara is attempting to explain, of which will be cross-cultural contact. Now, when we talk about cross-cultural contact in this situation, we are referring to the clash of two distinct cultures, of which one of them is the dominant culture. I'm referring to the Western culture, and then the other is the subservient or the inferior in quote culture, which is the African culture. Now, we know that before the 18th century, these two cultures had come in contact on the African soil. And like we had explained that the first Western culture is superior, it dominated the African culture. It imposed their lifestyle, their cultures, their ways of life. I'm talking about language, expression, music, and what have you, including mode of dressing, on the African culture. Therefore, the African man today is a hybrid of these two cultures. The African man is somewhat half Western and half African because he is a hybrid of these two cultures. Now, when the African culture received by force the Western culture, some of the elements of African culture will always be eroded or eradicated unconsciously. And then these are the issues that we are going to be looking at in Piano and Drums. Now, let's read the poem, Piano and Drums. When at break of day at a riverside, I hear the jungle drums telegraphing, the mystic rhythm, urgent, raw, like bleeding flesh, speaking of primal youth and the beginning. I see the panther ready to pounce, the leopard snarling, about to leap, the hunters crouch with spears poised, and my blood ripples, turns torrent, topples with years, and at once I'm in my mother's laps, a suckling. At once I'm walking simple paths with no innovations, rocked, fashioned with the naked warmth of hurrying feet and grouping hearts, in green leaves and wild flowers, Paul said. Then I hear a wailing piano, solo speaking of complex ways, in tear-furrowed concerto of faraway lands and new horizons with coaxing diminuendo, counterpoint, crescendo, but lost in the labyrinth of its complexities. It ends in the middle of a phrase of a dagger point. And the last stanza reads, and I lost in the morning mist of an age at the riverside, keep wandering in the mystic rhythm of jungle drums and the concerto. That is piano and drums. Now, the poet here, Gabriel Okara, is using a context of music to explain cultural context and conflict in this situation. Now, as we are going to be analyzing and explaining each and every stanza of this poem, but a quick understanding will reveal that the poet speaker has gone back in time and even gone forward in time to explain the situation. In this poem, Gabriel Okara, who happens perhaps to be the poet speaker, is explaining the cradle of his personal development and civilization right from his mother's heart. And then he says, when at break of day at the riverside, I hear the jungle drums telegraphing the mystic rhythm. I hear the jungle drums telegraphing the mystic rhythm. Now, in this situation, he tries to explain a context of the humble African beginning when he hears the jungle drums telegraphing. And he went further to explain that this drum is very urgent. It's raw like bleeding flesh, speaking of primal youth and the beginning. Now, do not forget that in this first aspect of the first stanza, the poet speaker is trying to chronicle the early beginnings of the African community even before colonial contact on African soil. He says that he hears the jungle drums. That means the very beginning, the primal youth. Primal youth means the very beginning, the cradle of the African society, which was very raw, very urgent. He likens that urgency to a bleeding flesh, and that is simile, urgent, raw, like bleeding flesh. And then immediately after that first part, there is a kind of what we call an aspect that is transported from drama and which is a flashback. He says, I see the panther ready to pounce. The panther means, of course, the tiger. The leopard snarling about to leap. The hunter's crotch with spears poised. We could see that that's typically the issue of the African community. Hunting, fishing, of which was the trade of the African people at the time. And then he admits that he immediately observes these things, his blood turns ripples and torrents, and topples years, and at once I'm in my mother's laps, a suckling. He is still taking us back in time to explain the development of his life in the African soil. And then he went further to say that at once I'm walking simple paths with no innovation. That still explains the primal beginning of Africa. Simple path, that means footpaths. That's how African societies were organized in pre-colonial times. No tarred roads, no development, just footpaths with no innovation. He admits here, rugs fashioned with the naked warmth of hurrying feet. Naked warmth of hurrying feet. That is personification, hurrying feet. But it explains the situation of pre-colonial Africa without civilization and development. And then he went further to say, warmth of hurrying feet and grouping hearts, green leaves and wildflowers pulsing. Now he is back to us now. And having fantasized this beauty of African pre-colonial societies, he clearly admits when he says in the third stanza, then I hear a wailing piano. Now, as he was enjoying his African society, the next thing that came to his mind or his ears was the wailing piano. That is the coming of the African, the coming of the Western culture. He has metamorphosed or metaphorically explained the coming of the Western culture on African soil when he says that as he was fantasizing the African life, as he was enjoying the jungle drums, as he was walking simple paths of African streets with no innovation, as he was watching the hunters hunting, as he was suckling in his mother's lips and breast, the next thing that came to his ears were what? A wailing piano. Solo speaking of complex ways. That is the strong feature of Western tradition. of which you know that Western cultures are usually individualistic in nature and very complex. That's what he means by this culture or this piano is solo speaking of complex ways, interior-footed concertos of faraway lands and new horizons. And he admitted that this wailing piano is so coaxing. Coaxing simply means it's interesting, it's inviting, that when this piano was played, it sounded very wonderful. And that is what really attracted the African society and people to Western tradition. Counterpoint, crescendo. And then he says that he is lost in the labyrinth of its complexity. Labyrinth of its complexity, there is the usage of metaphor. For sake of emphasis, the labyrinth is a path that is many. If you've been to a rural area and then you walk towards the footpath, you notice that at a point there is always more than 5 paths spreading across. That is called a labyrinth. And then he uses that instance to explain the level of his confusion when the Western culture came to African soil. That means he doesn't know whether to still maintain himself as an African or whether to tilt towards this concerto, this coaxing, wailing piano that it comes to him. And then he said it ends in the middle of a phrase at a dagger point. Now, in the last stanza, the poet speaker says that he is lost in the morning mist of an age at a riverside. Keep wondering. Now, do not forget that he did not end this poem by admitting his position, whether to be an African or a Westerner. He says that as he was listening to both musics, that's the music of the African man, which is in the drums, and the music of the Western culture, which is in the piano, he is in the labyrinth of these two very serious incidents. And he says that, and I lost in the morning mist of an age at a riverside, he kept wandering in the mystic rhythm of jungle drums and the concerto. That means he is an African by blood, but he does not really know whether to dump the African culture and pursue the Western tradition, which he admits to be very coaxing and interesting. So that is the confusion of the African man as put forward by Gabriel Okara in piano and drums. He uses these two musical instruments to explain the confusion of the African man, to explain the cradle and the development of the African society, in also explaining the dilemma, very important dilemma, and the state of confusion of the African man who has been lost in the midst of very two serious cultural groups. The African man is African by blood, but there comes a subordinate, a superior culture, I beg your pardon, to coax and even invite him to be part of the culture. Now let's look at the themes in the poem. The first is the theme of clash of culture, cultural clash. Now from the title of the poem, we had already suggested that culture clash will be a serious theme. The poet speaker strongly explains the situation of two cultures. The first is the Western culture, and the second is the African culture, the dominant and the subservient or inferior or perhaps subordinate culture. These two cultures clashed on the African soil. And then the African man doesn't even know whether to be part of the Western culture or to maintain his situation or his circumstance or perhaps his origination as an African man. So there is a very serious interplay of two cultures who have clashed, thereby bringing out a new person from the African man. The second theme is the theme of innocence. Now let's quickly run to the second stanza. The second stanza of the poem. We are going to see the theme of innocence there. Now in this, the poet speaker admits that, and my blood ripples, turns torrents, topples the years, and at once I'm in my mother's laps. That explains innocence. A suckling, a baby that is suckling means a baby that is still breastfed. The baby is not yet weaned, and that explains the issue of innocence. Now, apart from the innocence of the poet speaker, the innocence of the African society has also been chronicled and emphasized when the poet speaker says that at once he was walking simple paths with no innovation. Can you imagine that situation? A society where there were no innovations. Everybody were operating on the issue of innocence and brotherly friendship. He said this situation was wrong. It was fashioned with naked warmth of hurrying feet and groping hearts. This seriously explains the situation of innocence. And then he went further to say, he talks about green leaves and wildflowers pulsing. This is the issue of innocence, the childhood, the cradle of development and civilization of Africa. The footpaths with no innovations, they fashioned, they rocked, and even the naked warmth on hurrying feet, the suckling child, and even the lapse of the mother. All these explains the innocent development of the African continent before the emergence of Western culture. Now, the last theme in that context is the theme of dilemma. Dilemma means a situation where a person is faced with two difficult or perhaps unpleasant choices, of which he will be expected to choose one. Now, in this situation, the poet speaker has seriously expressed his dilemma. In fact, he ends this poem by maintaining that he is still confused of which line to toe or which way to go. Now, if you quickly follow me to the part of the poem, he says, having explained in the first stanza about the innocence and development of Africa, and also the coming of the Western tradition in the second and third stanza, he explains that he said when the Western culture came, this culture became so coaxing and it became so attractive to him. And in the last stanza he said, and I lost in the morning mist of an age at a riverside. Keep wondering. When somebody is wondering, that is also an expression of confusion and dilemma. And he is wandering between the mystic rhythm of jungle drums and the concerto. That becomes a situation of dilemma. We can also see an excerpt of dilemma when the poet speaker had used the word labyrinth, like I had explained. I said that labyrinth simply means a situation where there are many paths, footpaths, of which he does not even know which way to go. We can see it there when he says, a new horizon with coaxing diminuendo, counterpoint, crescendo, and then he admits that he is lost in the labyrinth of its complexities. That's a situation of dilemma. Imagine you moving along a footpath and then you happen to see 6 other footpaths spreading after that. In that case, you become confused. The poet speaker now uses this situation to explain the state of his confusion and dilemma. Now, let's quickly explain some figurative expressions as used in this poem. Now, the most dominant of these will be a technique we call run-on lines or enjambment. Now, when we're talking about literary terms, we had said that enjambment or run-on lines is that technique in poetry in which an idea is run over from one line to the next. For example, if you look at the first few lines of this poem, it said, I hear jungle drums telegraphing the mystic rhythm. Now look at the first and the second line. In the second line, you will agree that the full idea in that sentence will be, I hear the jungle drums telegraphing the mystic rhythm. But you see that the mystic rhythm has been run on to the next line. That technique in poetry is known as run-on lines or enjambment. You can see a host of all that technique in this poem. Now, when we look at further, we will see that I hear the jungle drums telegraphing the mystic rhythm, urgent roar, like bleeding flesh. That is the usage of simile. Simile is a figure of speech in which two contradictory concepts are compared using like or as. So we say that the music drum, the poet speaker says, is like bleeding flesh. You see, bleeding flesh and the jungle drums are contradictory, but they have been compared meaningfully using like, and that becomes simile. And then we move over to talk about some other aspect. He said, and my blood ripples turn torrent, topples the years, and at once I'm in my mother's laps, is suckling, and at once I'm walking paths with no innovation. That's metaphorical usage. Those no innovation, drug fashion, with naked warmed hurrying feet. All those are metaphorical expressions that are referring to the pre-colonial situations or societies of Africa. But we have seen the usage of feet, hurrying feet in that context. Feet in that context is a figurative usage known as synodic. Do not forget that we said synodic is that figurative expression where a part is used to represent a whole and vice versa. Now, feet in that situation is a part of the human body, and it is used to represent the whole, which is the human being. When we say hurrying feet, we are simply, of which the speaker is talking about, is the hurrying nature of humans, movement of humans as a whole. But feet is used to represent it. And we have also seen the next expression, grouping hearts. Grouping hearts. That's also the usage of synodic. We've seen green leaves, wildflowers, which are metaphors for innocence and development. And then we move on again to talk about these parts of the poem. He said, then I hear a wailing piano, solo speaking of complex ways, in tear-furrowed concerto. All these are metaphorical usages that talk about cross-cultural contact. And even in the title of the poem, Piano and Drums, that is a strong metaphorical application. The piano there metaphorically stands for the Western culture, whereas the drums is metaphorically talking about the African culture. That strongly is a usage of metaphor. That's very important. Now let's look at this question. Now, Gabriel Okoro's piano and drums paints the picture of dash. A, the beauty of music, the dilemma of the African man, the superiority of Western culture, the decline of moral principles. Now, you will agree with me that what Gabriel Okoro is talking about in piano and drums is not music. It's very important to note that. Even though he is using a title that suggests music, he is also painting the picture that suggests music. But what he is talking about is not music. He is only using the metaphors of music to explain the issue of cross-cultural contact or conflict. Very importantly, I had told you that the piano there is metaphorically talking about the Western culture, and then the drums is talking about the African culture. So music is only used as a means to an end and not the end itself. So the beauty of music there will not be the answer to that question. And even when we had run through the poem, we had seen issues like wailing piano, so coaxing, rhythm, drums and rhythms. All those are aspects of music talking about African life, but not necessarily music. You will agree that the correct answer to that question is the dilemma of the African man. Now, option C, which is the superiority of Western culture. Now, it is very important to note that even though we know that by implication, the Western culture is superior to the African culture, the poet speaker did not specifically maintain that. If he had implied that, then he would have ended the poem to explain that African men had all tilted towards the Western tradition. That means that even though the Western culture is superior, the African culture and the African man is still part and parcel of Africa. So that will not be the answer. Then the decline of moral principles is actually out of place. Okay, now having seen that the correct answer to that question is the dilemma of the African man, having successfully deleted or eliminated other options. Now we have successfully talked about two serious African poems on the recommendations. and that is Gabriel Okara's Piano and Drums, and The Dining Table by Gbanabom Hallowell. And we have explained these contexts ranging from the subject matter to the themes, the figurative applications, and all other necessary issues. I am very glad that you watched this video, and then look out for the next segment of this subject. Thank you very much for watching.